So we're back again with another one of these videos where I go over some of the tips and tricks that I use to ship and build products really fast. So just as a quick aside, a lot of these tips are from when I worked at Amazon for 4 years, and then also I've been building products for 7 to 8 years, and all these tips are from personal experience that I've learned and picked up over the years. So this is part 2, so if you want to watch the other one you can, but let's get started. Basically, the first tip is to not rush to automate things. So this one is probably the lesson that I have to learn over and over, because I have a tendency to just try to automate it with Python or use AI just to automate the thing. And I think the biggest mistake that I've learned, it's often better to ask if it's really required and if it's possible to even just delete the requirement. So I'll give you guys one example. In Exploding Insights, we have a bunch of databases, right? And the thing that we have to do manually is we have to run the script to scrape the data and then use that data in our web app. So that's like the process. And one thing that I was trying to do is I wanted to set up this like automation so that it would just run every month and I wouldn't have to worry about it, because like right now we're doing it all manually. And the problem that I have to correct myself is that like this one thing that I'm trying to automate, it would only take 2 minutes of my time, but it would take like hours trying to set up the entire automation. So I think the key part is realizing how much time you're actually saving and the impact of you trying to automate it. And if it's not worth it to automate, then you should just delete that requirement of even trying, and that'll save a lot of time. And then I think as a general rule of thumb is that you should just question every requirement and not try to automate or write scripts for everything. So that's just something I've learned and something that I think will speed up the entire process of building products. So the next one is to get the high level design right. So I'll like go over my entire process of how I design and create products. Obviously, we have the idea phase, and then we build the product, and then we like try to sell and market the product, right? So that's like the key 3 parts. And I think for the high level design, especially when you're trying to build a product, I think this is key because you don't want to pick specific languages or pick specific like frameworks or anything where you're kept into that environment. So one example is for one of my projects, the most recent B2B SaaS I made, it's called VidScale. I've shown it before, but basically it's like the site where you can create personalized videos at scale. And one of the things that we had to decide was how did we want to architecture the high level program, right? One of the main choices that I made is that I decided to use AWS Lambda. And the reason for that is because we process a lot of videos and Lambda would make it very easy to scale. So that was a choice that I made early on, and it was with the intention that later on it would save a lot more time if we had the correct infrastructure in place. That's just one example where you're thinking long term, and if this were to scale, like how easy is it to move, right? That's just one thought. But let's say it would take a lot more time to set it up in Lambda, then in that case it might not be worth it. It's this fine balance between making sure that it's simple, making sure that it can scale, but also making sure that you can get the product out in a reasonable amount of time, which is why it's like a bit hard for probably if you're like a beginner. But it's just something that just to keep in the back of your mind of things to consider, which is like scale and simplicity and just speed of getting the product out are like the 3 main things that I think of, especially when you're trying to build products that will last a long time. So let's move on to the next one, which is reuse code. So this one is really important because my mindset with code is that anytime you write code, you should think about making it into small component size code, which is code that can be reused across multiple code bases. So I'll tell you guys my exact workflow. Basically what I do is I'll like write code and it's like this one code base, right? So the code base for Exploding Insights actually was copied from another code base. So that project didn't take off. So I just cloned that project and I built insights on top of it. So I think it's just key that you keep your code very clean and simple so that if this one project doesn't work out, you can move on to a different project with the same code base where you just change the names, right? So that's one example. The other example is, especially when you have a web app with a lot of design, I think it's important to make sure that you create design pieces that you can just copy and paste over. So I will give you guys one specific example. So in Exploding Insights, we have this like little timer here, which shows you when the data is updated. I'm creating this other app that has like the same functionality where there's also this little timer in the app, right? So that's just one example where like you can copy the same design from one project to another, and that this will save actually a lot of times. Probably like 50% of the time where you rewrite the code, I think you can just copy and paste. And the other small tip is I just save all my code on GitHub, and then I can easily just copy and paste it for my new projects. Oh, and then one small thing is I use a boilerplate. So I use SaaS Pegasus, which is like this Django boilerplate. I'm not sponsored, but basically I think if you want to save time, just buy a boilerplate that has payments, auth. It will save you a lot of time, especially since every project needs those things. Let's move on to the next one, which is focus on the critical parts. So what I mean by this is every project, there's probably this one thing that people will pay money for, and then there's a lot of fluff on top of it that people don't really care about, but it's a nice to have. So one specific example from Exploding Insights, there's a lot of databases, right? So we have the Fiverr database, Acquire database, Indie Hackers database, and like all these are like data sets that people can use to find profitable ideas. So that's the entire idea of the app, and that's the problem that this app is trying to solve. The key part is not the UI, it's not this UX, but like it's actually the data. So what people actually want is the data that they can use to make ideas and to make any product. So I think recognizing what part of your app is critical and not critical, it's key, because once you realize this one part is important, then you can cut out a lot of the stuff that you think is important. So I think the first part is just realizing what problem you're trying to solve, how your product solves that problem, and then just cutting out all the fluff where it doesn't impact the product and the solution. And I think a lot of the parts that people spend a lot of time on, UI, UX, design, and like writing, like spelling check, whatever, like that's not really important, because people will only generally buy a product if it solves a problem, and if you solve that problem, they will buy it. I think this is not really coding related, but it's like a main part just to cut out a lot of fluff. The last tip is to steal what is already working. So what I mean by this is not directly copy and paste and just steal without any credit, but just observe what other companies are doing and don't reinvent the wheel. So I will give you guys a specific example. For Exploding Insights, the design of the main web app, I actually didn't come up with by myself. So I was just browsing other websites that had nice designs. And then one of the sites I really liked was a site called Landing Folio. And I really like the column on the left with different forms and then like the grid, right? I basically use that same design, but I didn't copy and paste it. I use it as inspiration, and that's something where it saved me a lot of time, because instead of trying to figure out and designing the best layout, I just looked at other people's website and see what I really liked and then used it for my own projects. So that's something which is pretty key, which is for design. I think it's pretty effective if you just check out 100 sites and then just pick out parts that you really like and then bring it onto your own projects. So that's for design. And then the other part is you can use the same principle when you're deciding on how you want to structure or plan out your business / product. This one page or this blog post, which is by this site called levels.fyi, they mentioned how they launched their product with just a single backend with a Google Sheets. So I read this, and when I was building Exploding Insights, I remember this blog post, and then I just copied the same principles, because the first version of this app, I actually had Google Sheets as the backend. So that's just another example where try to figure out like how other products launch really quickly and use those same principles for your own projects, because oftentimes even across different niches, same principles of how to launch fast can be applied for SaaS, e-com, and like courses or whatever, right? So that's the idea. And if you guys like this series, please leave a comment.